Welcome everybody to Forza Horizon 4, and today we're taking a look at the 1979 Triumph TR7 Roadster. Now this was produced between 1975 and 1981, with around 115,000 being made. 28,864 of them were this Roadster variant. It was, although initially only available as a hardtop coupe, as Triumph were worried about US regulations in terms of rollover protection, ruining the ability of them to make a convertible. So they initially made this car to only be a coupe, but then they reluctantly converted it into being able to make it into a convertible as well from 1979, which is when this version was introduced. And yeah, it's also our first ever car from British Leyland to have the British Leyland badge. Not a mark of quality or reliability, but it is nice to finally see it there on a car. Obviously we have several British Leyland vehicles on this game already. We have a couple of Land Rovers, we have a Rover SD1, the Triumph TR6 is technically a British Leyland car as well, that preceded this. So yeah, it's not the first British Leyland car that we've had, but it is the first to actually have a badge saying it. And yeah, I have been highly looking forward to this car, as yeah, it's a icon of the era really, in terms of its style and in terms of what it kind of meant for Triumph in the late 70s, which we'll get to in a minute. But first, this has a front engine rear wheel drive layout with the optional 5-speed manual gearbox, but it also came with, or it could come with, a 4-speed manual or a 3-speed automatic. And yeah, it has independent front suspension, which uses coil springs and damper struts, along with a lower single link at the front. It also has a rear. At the rear, it also has a 4-link system, again with coil springs, so it's very comfortable for a sports car. And it also has front and rear anti-roll bars and disc brakes at the front with drum brakes at the rear. So yeah, a fairly well sorted little sports car this, and it only weighs 2,249 pounds, so a lot less than other cars from the period, especially in America, where this car sold really rather well. Sold so well, in fact, that the car was delayed in terms of being launched in the UK twice, as it got released in the United States in January 1975, but it wasn't released over here until May 1976. So it was a massively successful car initially in the US, to the point of yeah, not even getting an initial British launch. And yeah, it's got a decent interior for the period. It doesn't look like a 70s interior in a lot of ways. It's got nice white on black dials, as you can see, and yeah, it's fairly well equipped. It does only have wind down windows, unfortunately, but you've got everything else that you would expect from a car from the period, especially one that is somewhat also prioritising being lightweight. And yeah, it also has a decent boot space as well, as you can see. And yeah, this version also has the optional rack on the rear as well for extra luggage capacity. And then you also might have a little bit of luggage capacity behind the seats as well. So a reasonably practical 2-seater sports car. And yeah, it's also got a reasonable amount of power as well. It's got a 2-litre inline-4 engine producing 92 horsepower and 106 pounds-feet of torque, which is decent, but it's less than it could be, because this is the US variant of this car, as you can tell by the really rather large bumpers, which were, you know, for 5-mile-an-hour impact bumpers, which came in on plenty of US cars from the period, and were forced upon imports as well. And yeah, the engine is also weaker than the UK version, as the UK version has 105 horsepower, so that's 13 extra than this version, and 119 pounds-feet of torque, which is again 13 more than this. So yeah, it's decidedly the less powerful version of the Triumph TR7, which only ever came with this engine and those free you know, gearboxes that were on offer as well. So yeah, not much choice in terms of variants, because obviously it's only this Roadster or the coupe, only the one engine to choose from, and only 3 gearboxes to choose from as well. So not a massive variety in terms of this car. But if you also wanted a bit more power, you can also get the TR8, which is a V8 version of this, although that was incredibly rare. I think only around 2,500 were made, most of which were exported to America. but it does support the 3.5 litre Rover V8, which we've already seen in the SD1, and yeah, that had between around 133 horsepower and around 148, depending on the year. And yeah, sadly you can't actually swap that engine into this car, despite the Rover SD1 being on this game, which is a bit of a shame, to be honest. So yeah, it does a bit, you know, sour the taste of getting this car in this game. That not only do we have the US variant of the car, but we also can't put the Rover V8 in it, which, yeah, like I said, does sour the overall taste of having this car in the game. But I am nonetheless glad that it is in the game, regardless. So yeah, nonetheless, let's get out onto the open road and see what this car can do. So yeah, 92 horsepower is not obviously the most amount of power you can get from a sports car at this period, which is a shame. I imagine if it had, you know, the extra 13 horsepower and the extra 13 pounds-feet of torque, that this would be a damn sight more fun and a damn sight more quicker. But it's still reasonable in terms of acceleration, and yeah, it's more than capable of dealing with traffic and anything like that. It's not like you're going to be struggling to overtake anyone or merge or anything like that. But yeah, it would have been a far more better car to have if it was the UK spec rather than the US spec. But I'll let you listen to the engine for a little bit and then we'll talk about it some more. So yeah, despite being the US spec, it does at least still rev as high as the UK version, which is nice, because yeah, plenty of US cars at the time were rather low revving and not great in terms of sound, so at least they didn't have to sacrifice the RPM limit to keep it in line with US emissions, which is good. And yeah, handling wise it's pretty good as well. Obviously it's not got the most amount of power to really challenge the suspension, the brakes and the tyres and the like, but it still handles really rather well. Doesn't have much in the way of roll, which would have been, or body roll should I say, which would be typical of cars from the period. And yeah, it's also got decent acceleration despite the lack of power. 0 to 60 in 12.2 seconds, 0 to 147.9 seconds, and it'll go on to a top speed of 109 miles an hour. No doubt that with the extra power and torque that you'd get in the UK version, that you'd be getting closer to 10 seconds to 60, probably under 40 seconds to 100, and probably could get up towards 120, maybe even 130 miles an hour. But that's still a decent amount of performance for this car, especially since, you know, it does invoke a kind of cruising attitude towards driving this car. It's not something that you need to really thrash, although it will take it if you wish to drive it a bit more aggressively. But on the whole, yeah, it is still a reasonable handling and reasonably enjoyable car to drive. But yeah, unfortunately it wasn't enough to save the Triumph overall. Like I was talking about the sales of this car originally, yes, 115,000 does sound a fair old amount for a car that was only around 6 years. Is a bit more niche in terms of the kind of car that it is. Obviously sports cars are obviously catering towards a certain demographic, a certain market and the like, but yeah, it certainly wasn't the sales success that it needed to be, and unfortunately, yeah, sports cars from Triumph were killed off after this, and yeah, they only really made one other car. I say made one other car, it's technically just a Honda that was rebadged, but yeah, after that Triumph Acclaim, which was the rebadged Honda, came out, yeah, Triumph were been and gone by that point. But then again, British Lane were on the verge of going anyway. They only lasted another 7 more years after this, and yeah, then they were all chopped up and sold off and renamed, and yeah, that was pretty much the end of it, which is a bit of a shame, because yeah, I imagine if this had more development, had more engine variety, it would have been a bigger hit. It's a shame they didn't give it more power or give it the Rover V8 engine as standard or as an option with this car, rather than just put it into a very limited production run of the TR8. But that's just the way it is sometimes. I do wish we had more British Lane cars though, because they did make some weird and kind of odd cars that really do deserve a place on this game, if not another Forza Motorsport game at some point, because I would like to try them out and see what they are like. But yeah, I am nonetheless glad that this car is on this game, even if it isn't the best version of the car, while also not, you know, being able to swap in the Rover V8 either. But at least it does have the 5-speed optional gearbox, which, yeah, really does help make the most out of what power it does have, because I imagine the 4-speed would be a hell of a lot worse to deal with this amount of power. But yeah, you get this car by doing the Super 7 challenges, just the same way as you would get with the Austin 7. As you can tell, the used cars as rewards that had 7 in their name. Austin 7, Triumph TR7, and yeah, it's well worth getting, just because it's a delightful slice of classic British motoring, even if it isn't quite as good as, say, the TR6, or as good as it could have been. Nonetheless, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.